So, your podcast, The Nomadic Executive, helps and talks to the digital nomad lifestyle, but you have another business that focuses a lot on content marketing. So, and you've said that content marketing funnels and podcasts are the centerpiece of getting a message out. So maybe you can elaborate on exactly what is it that you do in that business and how podcasting is such a centerpiece for that content marketing funnels.
Sure. So really, if you were to even break out the word podcasting, if you were to, aside from that word, if you were to just look at what podcasting is, essentially it's a piece of content that's one, incredibly easy to make because it's interview native. So it's not just you making the content, it's based off a conversation with somebody else. So two people are making the content. Number two, it's both in video and audio format, which can then be transcribed into written word. So really it's the most concentrated form of content out there. That's the easiest to make, that takes the least amount of time, which can then bleed into every aspect of your business when it comes to the content marketing side, right? It can be used as a webinar. It can, you can cut up the pieces into social media content for like the 7 relevant social media platforms: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Pinterest, TikTok, YouTube, one more, that LinkedIn, right? So those 7. So you can break the content out into there. You can build relationships and network with somebody while you're having the conversation with someone. You can, I have this whole like amazing graphic that I'll probably have to send you, that actually one of my clients made for me, that has like 18 different arrows in 18 different directions with what a podcast can do. So I'll send that to you later. But those are just some off the top of my head that would probably fit to any business model, anyone out there, and they could use the traffic for any direction. And as a marketer myself, coming actually from the digital marketing space back 6 years ago, I realized how useful and how valuable having such concentrated form of content, pillar content, as Gary Vee likes to call it, that goes in so many different directions, and as long as you're staying cutting edge with whatever platforms are working at this time and what platforms are going to be working next week and what platforms aren't working anymore as of last week, you can curate the content and make it native for those platforms from your pillar content, which is the podcast. Yeah, so what we do as a business, and I apologize, forgot to mention that, is what we essentially do is we do 3 separate things, right? We book people on podcast tours. So we get people on other podcasts, and then we can leverage that content and create it for them. We launch new podcasts for businesses and then have that as a content generation / lead generation source for their business. And then we also take existing podcasters and we cut up their content for them. And these are usually busy entrepreneurs that need some extension of their team, or just people that need more content marketing done on the side. And they've done a lot of podcasting already, but haven't really focused on their other social media platforms.
So does your digital marketing agency definitely uses podcasting as a centerpiece? Are there any other ancillary services that you also offer for these customers outside of just using podcasts as a centerpiece?
So podcasting isn't the only pillar content out there, but it is the most versatile pillar content out there, video podcasts specifically, not audio only. Other ones that we've also worked with are YouTube. So that is another video / audio format content that we cut up and use it as pieces of content for other pieces. But that's always shorter. So you'll find YouTube videos around 10 to 15 minutes. And if they're long form content, like 45 minutes, they probably have a podcast. So that's just less pillar content for us to cut up, which means less meaningful moments from that content get cut up. But we do work with YouTubers as well. And we have also worked with bloggers, but that's always the hardest because it's just written content. It's not an audio and video, and we need a voice or some video behind it. But what we do sometimes is take that like a blog post or something and cut it up into more LinkedIn pieces of content and tweets as well. So written into written.
How can business owners who have a podcast market their podcast out there, get more listeners, get more audience and viewers for that?
For their podcast.
Yeah.
So podcast is now here's the thing. I think people get too caught up in download numbers when they're not targeted, right? You have to realize that every download is incredibly targeted for your podcast. Anyone that's listening to your podcast and showing up over and over again really love what you have to say. They're sitting there for 30 to 45 minutes. You're in their ear and they love it. Okay. So the conversion rates that you'll see with these people is upwards to like 50 to 60% versus like Instagram, where it might be 2 to 3%, So keep that in mind. So that's why it's very important to see what kind of sponsors you bring on, or what affiliate products you're selling, or any services that you're selling. Make sure it's very catered to that audience. Now, really, to grow that audience in the first place, you got to be where they are. There are really the two biggest ways, and then there's a third way, and all of them take some elbow grease to get started, right? So the first way is really just paid advertising. Right. Paid advertising works no matter what business you're doing. And podcasting, if you look at it as a business, it's the same way. YouTube ads, Facebook ads, running traffic conversion campaigns instead of, or traffic campaigns instead of conversion campaigns for driving traffic back to your website with the podcast episode on there, and then running lookalike audiences to retarget people that are specifically in that niche that are similar to the people that are already listening to your podcast. And that can be done on any one of the paid advertising platforms. That's a strategy that we use. Number two, there is growing your social media following on some platform where you think your target audience is. So for example, I have a bunch of nomads and a lot of agency owners in my target audience. So my target audiences would probably reside mostly on LinkedIn and Instagram, but I use other social media platforms to get traffic as well, to get some listens and downloads and drive that traffic back. And it's a filtering process driving between like TikTok and YouTube and these other places back to my main social media platforms, right? So that's the second way, growing the social media following. And the third way is these like left field creative ways of using elbow grease if you have neither the budget nor the social media following. They're almost, you could call them growth hacking tactics to really grow your podcast. And with, I'll give you some over here, just that your audience can use. We use this thing called a speak pipe episode. We do this quarterly with all of our clients, as well as my own podcast. And what that essentially is, you can use it in a variety of ways, but there's this website called SpeakPipe that allows you to record little clips from people. It can be up to like 5 minutes long. And what we do is essentially we create a theme for that episode. Then we reach out to like 5 or 6 people that run groups, whether it's on LinkedIn or Facebook, and we reach out to them and say, hey, like you're an industry leader in this specific niche. We would love to have your voice on our podcast to give you a platform to speak, and you could really help inspire these entrepreneurs, blah, blah, blah. And get like 5 or 6 people, get their answer to a specific question, put that question as a title of your podcast episode, then record over that essentially and kind of do like a hosting thing where it's like you hosting and then you're just cutting and pasting those clips of them speaking in there. So then it becomes an episode where you're talking and there's like 5 or 6 thought leaders in there, and you push that onto your podcast episode. You send it out to the people that you had on the episode, and they promote it to their groups. That's generally what happens because they want to be seen as thought leaders, and they're already in that position with that Facebook group or LinkedIn group. And that way you get an influx of listeners for that episode, and a lot of them tend to stay. So that's one strategy that we use. And I'll give one more right off the bat that I actually heard myself quite recently that I'd like to share. And that is focusing less on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, which are the 2 biggest ones, and really focusing on distributing yourself on these obscure podcasting platforms. Things like, there are like 6 different platforms in India. There's like 4 in Japan. There's like all these different platforms. You can submit your RSS feed. And even if you're decently big enough, and what I mean by decently big enough is like, even if you have like 15 reviews on your podcast, which is like really nothing in retrospect, you can go out, cold email these guys and work out some sort of deal with them where you can get some ad space in return. You'll give them a shout out in your podcast. And essentially what happened is that since you're on their platforms, you're getting some sort of shout out from these guys. You're going to drive pure only podcast listener traffic straight to your podcast, which will up those download numbers as well. So those are 2 elbow grease methods that we use quite often. The second one being quite recently.
So I use Buzzsprout, and I know there's many of them out there, right? There's Buzzsprout, there's Anchor, there's Libsyn. Now with Buzzsprout, it distributes to a lot of podcast platforms, or a lot of listening platforms out there, such as Apple Podcasts, such as Spotify, Google Play. But then there's like Stitcher and iHeartRadio and some other ones that I can't remember the names of. The ones that you're mentioning, are they part of these platforms, or are they so obscure that, you know, we would have to do some Google searches to find them?
So you'd have to do some Google searches to find them. And there are lists out there that have them. There's a friend of mine, Mark Savant, who has actually curated a list together so that I can maybe send out to you guys later. Join his Facebook group. He has a Facebook group called After Hours Entrepreneur. That's where you can find it as well. Those are obscure. So be sure to like get on every single one on there on Buzzsprout. I know there's like 15 or 20 because I'm on Buzzsprout myself. But also aside from that, you'll find these other podcast distribution networks that you can go out and you have an RSS feed in Buzzsprout that you can just copy and paste. And what you're essentially doing is just submitting your RSS feed to these guys. Sometimes on their website, they have a place where you can submit the RSS feed straight away after you make an account. Sometimes you have to email them to actually get on there. So it depends on what the platform is, but there's a number of them. I'm talking like over 50 or 60 in the world.